r/nosleep. Hosted by you/nslewis. Climate Change, The Whole. Part 1. I remember looking out the helicopter window, down at the vast Siberian forest, rising here in a mountain, cut there by a river, and thinking how incredible the planet was, and what a trivial thing a human being was in comparison. That may be a strange thought to occur to an archaeologist, or perhaps not. After all, I was familiar with entire civilizations come and gone, the only remaining traces a few shards of pottery buried deep in the dirt, then too, entire species along the path to Homo sapiens, now nothing but fragments of nameless bones. The trouble began shortly after we touched down in a small clearing by the village. The 5 of us unloaded our gear and provisions beneath the whirling and roaring rotors, and then watched as the pilot, who was to return for us 3 weeks hence, lifted the helicopter back into the sky. Moments later, a man emerged from a path in the woods with an uneasy look on his face. This was Alyosha, the villager who had made the initial discovery that had brought us all out to the far northeastern reaches of Siberia. While hunting, Alyosha had spotted some bones jutting out of a stretch of recently thawed permafrost, along with some artifacts that appeared ancient. When the winter roads were in service, he had sent word through a relative back to Yakutsk, whence word was sent to Moscow, followed shortly by the bones, which were there tested, and determined to be approximately 40,000 years old and almost certainly Homo sapiens. This was remarkable, as all previous evidence had indicated that human beings had not arrived in that area until 20,000 years ago. Alyosha stepped tentatively towards our group, and I could sense that something was wrong. I whispered as much to my husband, Carlos. Carlos shrugged and reached for my hand, smiling. As a climate scientist, Carlos had managed to hustle up a grant to study the melting of the permafrost itself, which was happening far faster than projected in that region, and we had been absolutely delighted. It was our first expedition together. Alyosha began speaking in a low voice. He seemed very nervous to me, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. Only Ivan could. I watched as the smile that Ivan had greeted Alyosha with melted into a scowl, and I squeezed Carlos' hand tight. Alyosha went on, looking down at the ground as he spoke. When he was finished, he lifted his head and looked directly into Ivan's eyes. Ivan laughed. There was nothing good-natured about that laugh, it was menacing. He looked down at the ground for a moment, and when he lifted his head, his smile was back. He looked Alyosha in the face and started shaking his head, indicating something like, "I can't believe this," or else, more simply, "No." Without looking back, he extended his arm behind him, pointing at the rest of our group. Then he said something, slowly and deliberately. Alyosha looked at us over Ivan's shoulder, then spoke a few soft words. Ivan laughed that same horrible laugh. "Something's wrong," I said again, this time more loudly so that Bradley and Amy could also hear me. They had been flirting with each other and not paying much attention to the exchange between Ivan and Alyosha. "Ivan, mate," said Bradley. He was an old friend from grad school, currently stationed out of his hometown of London. He was the one who had managed, through extensive favor calling, to secure Amy, my protégé, of sorts, and me spots on the trip. He was also the only one of us who had ever met Ivan before. "Everything okay?" Bradley asked. Ivan ignored Bradley's question and said something rapidly and loudly to Alyosha. Alyosha shook his head, and then Ivan was upon him, grabbing a bunch of his shirt and actually lifting him off of his feet so that his eyes were now level to Ivan's, as Ivan was a tall and powerful man. When this happened, Carlos let go of my hand and ran over to where the altercation was happening. He gripped Ivan's shoulder in his hand, but Ivan paid him no mind. Ivan shouted something, and then Alyosha was flying through the air until he crashed to the ground on his backside. "Ivan," said Carlos. "Stop this." Ivan reached into his coat, withdrew a pistol, and pointed it at the supine Alyosha. The air was filled with shouts, as Amy, Bradley, Carlos and I all begged Ivan to put the gun down and tell us what was going on. Ivan ignored us and spoke at length in Russian, keeping the gun aimed at Alyosha. When Ivan had finished, Alyosha stared at him for a few moments, looked back to us with terrified eyes, and then nodded slowly. Ivan laughed once again, tucked his pistol back into his coat, and then offered a hand to Alyosha, who took it and rose to his feet. "Ivan," said Bradley. "What the bloody hell was that about?" "The simple people," said Ivan, "they are, what is the word? Superstitious." "What did he say?" asked Carlos. "He did not want us here anymore. He did not want us staying at his house. He did not want us going to the site." "But, where are we supposed to stay? I thought this was all arranged?" asked Amy. "We will stay at his house," said Ivan. "But he will not be staying with us. He will draw a map to the site, but he will not be going with us." Alyosha was looking down at the ground. He still looked terrified. Ivan, I said. Yes? He said, looking me in the eyes and raising his eyebrows. Why did you bring a gun? Ivan laughed, this time without menace. There are many dangerous animals in these woods. Then he pointed at Alyosha. He would cut your throat for your coat. I looked over to Alyosha, who was still staring down at the ground. He did not seem to be the dangerous one in this situation. We had to make the mile-long trek between Alyosha's house and the helicopter landing site a few times in order to carry all of our gear and belongings. Ivan insisted that somebody stay with the equipment left at the landing site, and somebody else stay with the equipment at Alyosha's house during each trip. When Amy had volunteered to stay at Alyosha's house during one of the trips, Ivan shook his head and said that it had to be a man. I jumped on the opportunity to volunteer Carlos to stay. I wanted a chance to talk with Bradley, as he was the only one who knew anything about Ivan. Fine by me, said Carlos, shrugging. Those solar panels weigh a ton. Nice, said Amy. Make the women carry all the heavy shit. A half an hour later, Amy, Bradley, and I were trudging through the forest with the solar panels and batteries. I can't believe Ivan pulled a gun on Alyosha, I said. Neither of them responded. He was ready to kill, I said. I saw it in his eyes. Jesus Christ, Alicia, said Amy, how did you want that to end? With us sleeping out in the open? We don't even have tents. She grunted as she shifted a battery from her right side to her left side. Ivan did what he had to do. We walked along in silence for a few minutes, then I said, just what do you know about him anyway, Bradley? Eh? Ivan? Next to nothing. I met him in Moscow one night while I was out on the town, and he sort of took me in and showed me around for the week. Introduced me to all sorts of people. He's got connections, in the government. What I want to know, I said, is why is he here? He's not an archaeologist, is he? Biologist, said Bradley. And he's here because I called him in the first place, trying to get us access. You know this has to go through the Russian bureaucracy. Plus he knows the terrain. Don't know if he's been to this village before, but he knows the ropes, Alicia. Like what happened back there. He knows what he's doing. I thought about that for a minute. I'm sure he does, I said. Once we had set up the equipment at Alyosha's house, we were all exhausted from travel. There were 3 rooms in the house, 2 bedrooms and a communal room. They were all small. One room had a set of bunk beds, which is where Amy and Bradley retired to. Carlos and I headed to the other bedroom, with a single bed, crude by US standards, as everything there was, of course. Within a few minutes of stripping down, Carlos was snoring. But I could not sleep, despite the exhaustion. Now that we were settled in, I was awake with excitement, as I always was on the eve of a dig in a new, far-flung location. It was 9 p.m., but sunlight was still pouring in through the window, through and around the curtains. After an hour of staring up at the ceiling, I decided to step outside and write in my journal for a bit. Maybe read some. I crept into the communal room, where Ivan was to sleep, and saw that he was not on the mat that he had lain out on the floor. For a moment, I considered turning around and suffering through Carlos snoring, but finally decided against it. When I opened the front door to the house, I saw that Ivan was sitting outside in a wooden chair, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, staring up at the sky. He turned his head enough to see me, then looked back up at the sky, still quite bright with the sun. He reached down to the ground, brought up a bottle and took a long drink. Then, without looking at me, he reached back and held the bottle up. I took it, put it to my lips, and had a swallow of vodka. He smiled as I handed the bottle back. You did not like what I did before, he said, still not quite looking at me. No, I said. You are kind, said Ivan, but a fool. Weak. Do you think that's a microphone and not a bottle? I said. Or are you going to drink? Now Ivan turned to me as he laughed. It wasn't a laugh like before. But it made me replay the scene in my head, for the 4th or 5th time. He lifted the bottle, drank, and passed it to me. I took a deep swallow, feeling the warmth spread through my tired body. What did you mean? I said. You said that the villagers were superstitious. What did Alyosha say to you? He was frightened. Why? Ivan shrugged. His friends died. They got sick after they go to sight. Diavel, he tells me. The devil. But that is not it, right Alicia? Anthrax, I said, passing the bottle back to Ivan. I try to tell him. It has happened before. The deer have anthrax and they are frozen for a long time, and when they thaw, the anthrax comes too. You know. But he would not listen. What would you have me do? I thought back to that terrible laugh, and the ease with which Ivan had thrown Alyosha through the air like the cigarette butt that he now tossed to the ground. You didn't have to point a gun at him. Ivan shrugged again. He listened to that. We were silent for a moment, and then Ivan spoke up again. Shh, he said. Listen. The wolves are out. In the distance, I could hear wolves howling in the white night. In the morning, we ventured out, leaving my husband behind at Alyosha's house. Ivan had insisted. They will steal everything, he said, so one of us must stay behind. How about you? I said. You stay behind. I am afraid that is not possible, said Ivan. Hell, I'll stay, said Carlos. You archaeologists do your thing and I'll come out tomorrow. Is this really necessary? I asked, upset that I wouldn't get to spend that first day uncovering new wonders with the love of my life when he was so close, and we had traveled so far together. Ivan nodded. It is time, he said. Follow me. According to Alyosha's map, the site was 2 miles away, but we never made it there, that day or any other. Rather, we made our way deeper and deeper into the woods, burdened with gear, for about 1 mile when suddenly Ivan, who was leading the procession, stopped dead in his tracks. Amy, who was directly behind him, ran straight into his back. What the hell, Ivan? She asked. He turned around and held his index finger to his lips. We stood silently. I strained to listen and finally I heard something snap in the woods to our west. Get down, said Ivan. He whipped the pistol out of his jacket and fired westward, the sound a brutal crack in the still air. I dropped to the ground along with Ivan and Bradley, but Amy did not until a few seconds later. And when Amy dropped to the ground, she had the shaft of an arrow sticking out of her forehead. She was staring at me with dead eyes, a trickle of blood working its way down her face. Jesus fuck, said Bradley. Ivan roared and was up, running westward, pistol in hand. I heard a twang and a thump and looked over. I looked away from Amy's dead and horrifying face, to see an arrow stuck in the ground a few feet away from my own head. Then I heard 3 explosions, 3 gunshots, drowning out Ivan's animalistic roar. I closed my eyes and heard many branches snapping. Ivan had stopped roaring. The sound of the snapping branches was getting louder. Getting closer. I kept my eyes closed. It was Alyosha, said Ivan. He killed Amy. I killed him. I opened my eyes and saw Ivan standing there. Then I heard Bradley. He began to wail. We have to get her help. He choked out, in between sobs. She's dead, I said, standing up, my face wet with tears. She is, said Ivan, tucking the pistol back into his coat. I want to go home, said Bradley, still on the ground. Please. We will collect her on return trip, said Ivan. Come. He started walking. Come on, Bradley, I said. We have to carry her back to the village. Do you think you can do that? I want to go home, said Bradley, staring at Amy's dead body. We will, I said. We should bring Amy with us. We can't leave her out here. The animals will get her. Could you help me carry her? Ivan stopped walking and turned to us. Come, he said. We are almost there. I want to go home, said Bradley. Damn it, Bradley, I said, we'll go home, but we can't leave Amy here. Do you understand? Bradley nodded and rose slowly to his feet. Good boy, I said. We'll leave the gear here, okay? Just drop your pack and help me with Amy. Then we can call for the helicopter on the radio and go home, okay? Can you do that? Bradley wiped his nose with the back of his hand and nodded. Come, said Ivan. He had the gun out again and was pointing it at us now. His eyes spoke of insanity. We are almost there. We are almost to the hole. I bit my lip until it bled and then I took Bradley's hand in mine and said, Listen to me, Bradley. We are going to go home. We are going to take Amy with us. But first, we have to go to the hole. Okay? Can you do that? Bradley nodded. Ivan turned around and resumed walking, gun in hand. We followed. I loved her, said Bradley, as we trudged along behind Ivan. Bradley had only met Amy in person a week before, at an airport in London, so I didn't think it was true that he loved her, at least not as I understood love, but I decided that it wasn't my place to determine that. I'm so sorry, Bradley. Amy was an amazing person. I'm going to miss her dearly. Why did we leave her there? His face was twisted in pain. Where are we going? Why aren't we going back home? We were going to the hole, whatever that was. Just hang in there, Bradley. This is almost over. It's his fault, growled Bradley, glaring up at the back of Ivan's head 30 feet in front of us. His fault she's dead. He knew exactly what we were getting into. We should have turned around after that fight with Alyosha right when we landed in this hellhole. Ivan stopped walking and turned towards us, waiting for us to get closer. Just ahead, he said. It is time for suits. We unfurled the hazmat suits that were strapped to our packs and stepped into them. Just on the other side of this hill, said Ivan. Come. We climbed the hill and standing at the top I saw it, what Ivan was calling the hole. It was a massive crater carved into the valley floor, the likes of which have begun appearing in Siberia in the past several years, supposed to be caused by explosions of methane released by melting permafrost. I had seen photographs of them, in the news reports and in my husband's files, but seeing one in person was something else entirely. It was breathtaking, and reminded me of the first time, as a teenager, I had seen the Grand Canyon in person. I had been driving through a forest with my family and then all of a sudden the world seemed to drop off in an unreal way. I estimated that it was about 100 feet in diameter, but there was no telling, from that vantage point on the hill, how deep it was, for it dropped off into pitch black darkness. But then, after the darkness, there was a faint red glow. Certainly, that aspect was unlike any of the other craters I had seen in the photographs, or that Carlos had described. What is that glow? I asked. Ivan turned to me, and through the plastic shield of his hazmat suit, I saw that his eyes were lit up with excitement and he was grinning like a child. That, Alicia, we are going to find out. Come. We climbed down the hill and then we were next to the crater. I looked down, perhaps 75 feet, and there at the bottom was a sheet of something bright red, glowing, lighting up the sides of the crater. The sheet of red was moving, as an ocean, or something alive. What is that? I asked without realizing it. Rope, said Ivan, tossing his pack to the ground. Give me your rope. He opened his pack, reached in, and pulled out his loop of rope. What are you thinking? I asked. I am going down there, said Ivan. With rope? I said. Do you have a harness? Because I don't. Ivan shook his head. That's insane. Ivan shrugged. Do you want to know what that red ocean is? I did, very much. Let him go, said Bradley. If he wants to go, let him go, and let's get this over with and go home. Just right, Bradley, said Ivan. I will go down, get sample, come up, then we go home. Simple. Alicia? I nodded and handed him my loop of rope. He tied one end to the end of his loop in a tight knot, and then tied the other end to Bradley's rope, for a total of 150 feet of rope. He wrapped the rope around the trunk of a nearby and massive pine tree. Then he walked over and threw the loop into the crater. He clipped a few items to his suit with carabiners, a flashlight, a knife, a metal jar, a camera, a ladle, and his pistol. He nodded to me and Bradley, and stepped into the crater. The first 20 feet or so were steep, but jagged, and there were many footholds. Ivan traversed this portion easily. But then the crater fell into a sheer drop, and the walls became smoother. Ivan paused here, gripping the rope tightly, looked down, and then began to lower himself slowly and carefully, searching with his foot for any jut or nook that it could find. I realized that I was holding my breath. Ivan worked his way down, and when he was halfway to the bottom, I turned and saw Bradley going through his bag. He came out with a knife. Bradley, what are you doing? I'm going to cut his bloody rope and then we're going to walk back and take Amy home. I saw that his eyes were full of rage. You will be killing him. He can't make it back up without that rope. No more, no less than what he did to Amy, eh? Bradley said, clenching the knife so hard that his hand shook. I can't let you do that, Bradley. No, Alicia? You give a shit about him? He's a psychopath. You know that. You knew it right away. When we get back to Moscow, we will see that Ivan is reprimanded for his actions here. But we're not killers, Bradley. Put the knife down. Bradley glanced at the taut rope stretching down into the crater, looked back at me, and threw the knife down to clatter on a rock. Fuck, he said. Thank you, I said, my heart slowing down, my head decompressing. I turned back to the crater. Ivan was inching his way down to the strange glowing red ocean. His foot slipped and I gasped as his hand slipped through the rope for a few feet until he was able to brace himself against the wall. After several minutes, he was close enough that he could jump down to a ledge just above the red material. He lay on his stomach and peered down below him. What is it? I shouted. He looked up and shouted something back, but I couldn't make it out. What? This time I heard him, the word echoing up from the crater walls. Worms. Climate change, vertusvermum. Part 2. With our assistance, Ivan made it out of the crater. Once on solid ground, he lay on his back and stared up at us with a wide smile showing behind the plastic of the hazmat suit. He unclipped the metal jar from his suit and held it up to me. Look, Alicia. Look, Bradley. I unscrewed the lid and looked inside. 5 or 6 worms were writhing around, glowing red. I showed them to Bradley. Those are really bioluminescent worms down there? Jesus Christ, there must be a million of them. For a moment, the intense grief gripping his face had dissipated, and he looked interested in life again. Ivan stood up. Just so. A million. I have never seen it. I have never seen even one such worm, that glows red. I looked down into the crater one more time as I screwed the lid back on the container. I knew that it was an amazing discovery, one that would shock the world and be plastered over the internet. A million glowing red worms at the bottom of a mysterious crater. I handed the jar back to Ivan. I presume that you got what you came for, then? We should be getting back. I looked at Bradley. The sour look had returned to his face. Of course, said Ivan, smiling. Let us retrieve Amy, return to our camp, and radio the helicopter. You will allow me a few photographs from above first? Take your bloody pictures and be quick about it, said Bradley. Ivan shot a dozen photos and then we walked back up the hill. When we reached the top, Ivan snapped a few more photos and said, I think it is safe to take off suits. I took one last look at the crater before I took off my hazmat suit and headed down the hill with the others, back towards Amy's corpse. As we got closer, I saw that Bradley was crying again. I felt like crying as well, but I didn't. I would save it for later, when I was with Carlos in bed, after business had been attended to. As we turned a bend in the path, we saw it. A wolf, large and gray, was hunched over Amy's body, pulling her intestines out with its teeth. I felt my stomach lurch. Get away from her, shouted Bradley. The wolf turned its head and growled at us around its meal. Shoot at Ivan. Ivan pulled his gun out of his coat and fired it, not at the wolf, but at a nearby tree, causing a chunk of bark to tear loose and soar through the air. The wolf ran, a string of intestines still in its jaw, trailing behind, and disappeared into the thick forest. Bradley dropped to his knees and buried his face in his hands. Ivan walked over and, to my surprise, put his hand gently on Bradley's shoulder. Don't you fucking touch me, growled Bradley. Ivan lifted his hand and sighed. He walked over to Amy's body, unrolled his hazmat suit again, and wrapped it around her midsection, covering the gore. Turn around, he said. I did, but Bradley did not. When I looked again, the arrow was gone from her head. He must have pushed it through, rather than pulled it, or else her forehead would not have looked so clean. I will lift under her arms, Bradley, and you lift her legs behind you. Fuck you, said Bradley. I'll take her under the arms. He walked over and began to lift her, but turned pale and dropped to the ground himself. I'll take her legs, I said. Ivan, you take her arms. Bradley, you lead the way. Bradley turned his head and was sick. Then, still quite pale, he stood up, wiped his mouth, and said, okay. I'll lead the way. And that is how we proceeded through the woods, with Bradley in front, followed by me, holding the cold dead legs of my colleague and friend, with Ivan in the rear, his jar of worms clipped to his belt. The foul odor of Amy's mutilated viscera moved with us every step of the way. When we emerged from the woods, I saw a dozen or so men, including Carlos, standing in front of Alyosha's house. Alyosha's corpse was at their feet. Carlos saw me and began walking over, his face overtaken with worry. Alicia. Then he saw that I was carrying Amy's body. He began running. What the hell happened? He shouted. Bradley was scowling at Alyosha's body. He spat in that direction as the villagers watched. Their faces were expressionless, watching us carefully. Bradley, said Ivan. I will talk to them. You stay here. Alicia, we put Amy down now. We set Amy's body on the ground and I hugged onto Carlos, who was staring in shock at the corpse. Now the tears were streaming down my face, and I was sobbing. Carlos patiently stroked the back of my head in silence. But still, matters were unsettled. I took a deep breath, blinked away the tears and broke away from Carlos in order to watch Ivan. He had reached the villagers and they were speaking calmly over Alyosha's body, too calmly, it seemed to me. Ivan pointed first at Alyosha, then at Amy, then himself, then Alyosha again. It was clear that he was recounting the order of the killings. After some discussion, two men broke away from the group along with Ivan and headed towards us. One of them bent over Amy's head and inspected the arrow wound. Don't you fucking touch her, said Bradley. Bradley, said Ivan in a completely flat tone, I will shot you. Bradley scowled, but said nothing more. The villager lifted Amy's head and looked at the back of it, where the arrow had been pushed through. He turned to Ivan and said something. Ivan responded. The man then pointed to Amy's abdomen, still wrapped tightly in Ivan's hazmat suit. Ivan talked for a minute, and then the man stood up and the two villagers walked with Ivan back to the group still standing over Alyosha. They resumed their conversation for several minutes. At last, Ivan walked back to where Bradley, Carlos, and I were standing, over Amy's corpse. "We are okay, I think," he said. "I told them that we are calling for helicopter now. We can stay until it comes. They will burn Alyosha in front of his house tonight." He paused, looking down at Amy. "Now we must decide what to do with her. They will let us burn her, behind the house." "No," said Bradley. "She's coming home with me." Flies had begun to gather around the body. The stench was overpowering now. "We should burn her, Bradley," I said. I knew Amy well. I checked the urge to add that I knew her much better than Bradley did, who had only known her for a week. I checked the urge to tell him that he had no right to make this decision, least of all to bring her back to London. I checked the urge to tell him that by the time we made it back to civilization, her body would be rotten, and by the time we made it back west, it would be weeks later and the funeral bills would be astronomical. That plan was insane, as was he, at the moment. Instead, I simply said, "This is what she would have wanted." And it was true, I felt. Bradley bit his lip. "God," he said, "she was so excited to be here. Said it was so beautiful here." He began sobbing. "Do you really think this is what she would have wanted?" he asked, his face torn with pain, looking at me. "Yes," I said. "We will have a service for her tonight. We will talk about what a beautiful soul Amy was." "Okay," said Bradley, now with relief. "Okay, yes. We will burn her tonight." "We go inside now and call helicopter," said Ivan. He pointed to the villagers. "If we pay them, they will watch over Amy, to make sure no animal comes." "No," said Bradley. "Fuck them. I'll stay." Ivan shrugged and Carlos and I walked with him towards the house while Bradley stayed with the body. The villagers stepped aside for us, and I looked briefly down at Alyosha's corpse. There were 3 entry wounds, 2 in the chest, and 1 in the center of his forehead. We passed him by and went inside. Carlos and I went into our room while Ivan used the radio. I told him everything that had happened, sobbing through the portion where Amy was killed, and then again when we came back to her body. Carlos wept quietly as well. When I was finished, we lay holding each other for a long time. "This is going to sound insensitive," Carlos said, "but what is burning in my mind just now is that crater. All of the others that I know about have been barren. Maybe a frozen lake at the bottom with no life growing within. But a seemingly solid mass of glowing worms? That is absolutely incredible." "No," I said. "We are honest with each other. That is what I keep coming back to as well, despite the horror and the tragedy. It was the most mysteriously amazing thing I have ever seen with my own eyes." Carlos sighed. "I wish I could have seen it. But we have to go, don't we? The situation with the villagers isn't tenable." "It's not," I agreed. "Nor, I think, the situation with Bradley. He has convinced himself that he was in love with Amy. I don't think that he will last in good health for any amount of time here. We have to get him back." "We should probably go back out there and keep him company," said Carlos. "It's not good for him to be alone, I don't think. I just needed to know what happened." "Yes, let's go. But we can see Ivan first. I want to show you the photographs that he took of the crater. And the worms." "I would like that," said Carlos. We got out of bed and went into the communal room, where Ivan was drinking from a bottle of vodka. "Day after tomorrow, helicopter will arrive," he said. "Tomorrow, we stay low." "Can you show Carlos the pictures you took of the crater?" I asked. "And the worms you brought back?" Ivan grinned widely. He reached across the table to where his digital camera was sitting, turned it on, and found the photographs of the crater. Carlos paged through them in wonder. "My God," he said, "it's incredible." Then Ivan set the jar of worms on the table. He had already transferred them from the metal jar to a glass jar with a metal lid, into which he had poked several air holes. They were writhing around in there, red and glowing. That night, we built a pyre for Amy and burned her body, while we passed the bottle around and talked about her. Even Ivan had a few kind and humorous words to say, garnered from correspondences and the few days that he had traveled with her. We heard wild shouts and music coming from the other side of the house, where Alyosha's funeral was being conducted. The air was filled with the aroma of roasting meat, and I had to keep it from my mind that it was the burning flesh of my colleague and friend that I smelled. The vodka helped a great deal. Finally, we retired, while Bradley stayed by the fire, still drinking from the bottle. In the morning, I awoke before Carlos and went into the communal room to make coffee. Ivan was standing there, and when he saw me, he pointed to the table with a pained expression on his face. The glass jar that had held the worms was empty. They had apparently eaten a large hole through the lid, and were nowhere to be seen. Ivan, Carlos, and I sat at the table, sipping bitter coffee, staring at the empty jar. A search of the house had turned up nothing but Bradley sleeping in his room on the floor next to 2 empty bottles. I must go back, said Ivan. I must bring samples. I'll come with you, said Carlos immediately. No, I said. Alyosha was trying to stop us from reaching that crater. That's clear to me now. Who will be in the woods this time, arrow-notched, waiting? How many will there be? Ivan shook his head. Alyosha was crazy. The villagers know this. That is reason we are not all dead. We should get permission, said Carlos. We should talk to them beforehand, let them know that we are leaving tomorrow and must make one more trip to the crater. Ivan waved his hand in the air. Fine, he said. Even if it were safe to traverse those woods again, I said, it is not safe, what you did yesterday, Ivan, the way that you climbed down there with just a rope. We can make a harness, said Carlos. That's not a problem. Alicia, I want to see that crater in person. And while I'm out there, I want to take some measurements. After all, that's nominally why I'm here. I sighed. I knew that I had lost. Okay, I said. But I have to stay here with Bradley. He can't go out there again and he can't be alone. He's a grown man, said Carlos frowning. I had hoped that you would come too. No, said Ivan. She is right. Bradley. He is crazy. He's grieving, I said. Ivan waved his hand in the air again. Fine. Grieving. One more thing, I said, looking directly into Ivan's eyes. You give the gun to Carlos, and he carries it. Ivan frowned. We will be safer if I have gun. I thought back to when Amy had died. Bradley and I had been ready to turn around and carry Amy with us. Then Ivan had pointed the gun at us, with a wild look in his eyes. It's non-negotiable, I said. Carlos carries the pistol. Ivan waved his hand in the air a third time. Fine, he muttered. He stood up, went over to his sleeping mat, withdrew the gun from under the foot, and then dropped it on the table. Carlos looked at it uncertainly. Take it, I said. Carlos picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and set it back down. Okay, he said. I'll carry it. I heard a groan, and then Bradley was running past us, towards the exterior door. He opened it and retched. Through the doorway, I saw a few villagers still sitting around the smoldering funeral pyre of Alyosha, bottles in hand. They looked in at us impassively. Bradley wiped his mouth, shut the door, and sat down with us, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Bloody hell, he said through a dry mouth whose reek reached across the table to my nose. Tell me we have some strong painkillers in the first aid kit. His eyes were bloodshot, almost pure red. By mid-morning, my husband had left with Ivan, and Bradley had retired back to his room. I heard him groaning in there, as I sat down at my laptop to begin to write up my experiences. I like to write important experiences down, shortly after they occur, or while they are occurring, in order to keep a record of how things really happened, unmolested by the tricks of memory. The result of that morning's writing was much of what you have read so far. By noon, it had begun to rain, lightly at first, and then in a heavy, steady downpour. I grew worried, hoping that my husband and Ivan were on their way back. The climb into the crater had been dangerous enough the day before, slick with rain, the walls would surely be impossible to scale. But something told me that Ivan would attempt it anyway. My thoughts were pierced by a terrible scream coming from Bradley's room. I rushed in to find him sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat. Are you okay? I asked. Why, yes, said Bradley, weakly. Just a nightmare. All of the color had drained out of his face. 2 red bloodshot eyes stared out of a deathly pale face. I brought him some water and sat down on the bed next to him. Tomorrow, we will be out of this place, I said. I want you to see a doctor in Yakutsk before we head back to Moscow, yes? He lifted the glass with a trembling hand and drank, spilling much of it down his chin. No, he said, I'm fine, just a bit much to drink last night, eh? Jesus though, he said, attempting a chuckle but achieving more of a choked gasp, what a fool. My head feels like it's going to explode, but I'll be just fine, Alicia. Just need to sleep it off. Nothing about him looked fine. At least let me take your temperature. He nodded, so I went out and rummaged through the first aid kit to retrieve the thermometer and some acetaminophen, in case he had a fever. As it turned out, he did have a fever, of 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I made him swallow the pills as I held the water glass steady, and told him to keep resting. Thanks, Doc, he said, giving an anemic smile. He lay down and I began to leave. Alicia. Yes? You're a good friend. Amy was lucky to have you in her life. I know I'm a mess just now. I'll come out of it. Don't worry about me. Yeah? Sure, Bradley. You just get some rest, okay? He gave me a thumbs up with his trembling hand, and I closed the door on my way out of the room. I wrote a few more paragraphs in my electronic journal, made some tea, and picked up the history of that region of Siberia that I was halfway through. I read for a while, trying to put the anxiety about my husband, out there in the rain-soaked forest, and anxiety about Bradley, who looked to be on death's door. But anxiety got the better of me, and I had to put the book down. Anthrax, I thought. He has anthrax. Maybe I did, too, as well as Ivan, and now my husband. I heard Bradley scream again. I put a towel over my face, on the chance that I was not yet infected with whatever he was infected with, and cracked the door open to look inside. Bradley appeared to be asleep, but was muttering something. I opened the door a little further, and strained to hear. My knowledge of Latin is limited to scientific classifications, and a few hazy memories of undergrad courses. But that was enough to make me shudder in terror as I closed the door and backed away from the room. Virtus vermum, he was saying, on repeat. Virtus vermum. It means the virtue of the worms. 2 hours later, the front door opened, and my husband walked in, soaking wet and laughing heartily. Ivan was behind him, patting him on the back and smiling profusely. But when Carlos saw me, sitting in a chair with my hazmat suit on, the laughter died on his closing mouth. I ran up and hugged him tightly. "Why are you in your suit?" he asked, hugging me back. "Bradley is sick," I said, pulling away. "I think it may be anthrax. Or..." Carlos frowned. "Are you sure it's not just a bad hangover?" "You'll be sure once you see him. He has a fever." Carlos looked me over. "Anthrax isn't contagious though, right?" "It's not, but we don't know where he got it from. And I'm not sure it is anthrax. But it's something, Carlos. Oh, God. He was." "What?" He was saying it over and over again. "Virtus vermum." Ivan frowned. "Strength of worms," he said, and looked down at the metal container clipped to his belt. "Let's have a look," said Carlos. "Put your suits on first," I said. Carlos and Ivan suited up. Carlos slowly opened the door to Bradley's room to reveal Bradley, twisting around on the floor. He had soiled himself, and a puddle of blood-spotted vomit collected near his head. "Jesus," said Carlos. Then Bradley stopped writhing and sat up. With eyes still closed, in a low growl, he said, "In omne terra et caelo et mare fiant fermes." Then he fell back to the ground and began twisting around again. "Jesus," said Carlos again, closing the door. "What was that?" I asked. "In every land, in all the sky and all the sea, let there be worms," said Carlos, frowning through his hazmat suit. "We must be kind and shoot him," said Ivan. "We're not going to fucking shoot him," I yelled. "We are going to get him treatment immediately once we reach Yakutsk. Try the radio again. This is an emergency. Get that helicopter here now." "No good," said Ivan, pointing to the window where a ceaseless torrent of rain was pounding. I knew that he was correct, but I demanded he try anyway. He shrugged and headed over to the radio. After a brief conversation, he looked at me and shook his head. "We may want to consider that Ivan is right," said Carlos as we heard Bradley began screaming in agony again. "I don't think that this is something he's going to come back from." "Absolutely not," I said, pacing around the room. "We don't even know what it is." After several minutes, the screaming died down. Ivan rolled up a cigarette and stepped outside, unzipping his suit. "What should we do?" asked Carlos. "We'll get him cleaned up and situated back in bed. Then I don't there is anything we can do but wait until tomorrow." We went about the unpleasant task of cleaning Bradley. Then we lifted him back into his bed and left him there as he sucked in the air through ragged, wheezing gasps. Climate change, the 7th shot. Finale. In the morning, I was shocked to find Bradley in the communal room, making coffee while he whistled. When he saw me, he stopped whistling and his cheeks turned crimson. "Ah, darling," he said, "I'm so embarrassed. I can't thank you enough for taking care of me yesterday. You're okay? I thought you were going to die." He smiled sheepishly. "I thought so too at times. I made a fool of myself. I'm never drinking again, I can tell you that much." "That was more than a hangover, Bradley. You had a fever and were vomiting blood. I can't believe you're on your feet. You look good." Bradley shrugged. "Just had to sleep it off, eh? I can tell you something else, I can't wait to get out of this fucking hellhole. I don't think I'll ever stop having nightmares about this place. Do you remember what you were saying yesterday? About the worms? He handed me a cup of coffee. No. Must have been fever dreams, I suppose. I looked around and saw that Ivan's sleeping mat was empty. Where's Ivan? I asked. Bradley shrugged. He was gone when I came out here. Carlos came out of our room, expressed his astonishment and relief to see Bradley up and about, and then we began packing. Just as we were finishing up, Ivan opened the front door, followed by 2 villagers. We leave solar equipment here, said Ivan. That is price we pay to stay here after Alyosha. And they will help us to helicopter. He indicated to the 2 men, and then began speaking to them, pointing at our bags. They nodded and began to haul our equipment outside. Bradley, you are feeling better, said Ivan in a flat tone. It seems that your illness was shared by several villagers as well. So I am told. They are all doing much better now. Damnedest thing, said Bradley. Carlos, said Ivan. I may have my pistol now? No, I said sharply. Not until we're in Yakutsk. Very well, said Ivan. We have breakfast and we go. As we were walking to the clearing where the helicopter would land, I felt relief wash over me. Relief that Bradley was better, that my husband was by my side, and that we were leaving this experience behind us. I also felt regret. I had been so looking forward to the dig, and we had never even made it to the actual site. So, I asked Carlos. What did you think of the crater? Amazing, he said, smiling. Breathtaking. That red glow. And it was incredible. Even from the top of the hill, my meter was maxed out. That's never happened before. There is an unbelievable amount of methane pouring up from that crater. Now he frowned. Which does not bode well for humanity. This requires more study, Alicia. We've seen the craters before. But never one like this. Maybe, I said. But we'll let somebody else study this one, my dear. Carlos smiled again and took my hand. That sounds like a splendid idea, my dear. We walked to the clearing and waited for the helicopter. Right on time, we heard the roar of the engine and the whirling of the rotors in the distance, growing louder. Bradley stood up, looked at each of us in turn. I have a special announcement to make, he said in a loud voice, so that he could be heard over the approaching helicopter. You are all very fortunate. You will all serve as hosts to the great worms. The helicopter came into view as Bradley blinked and his eyes became glowing red orbs. As I sat in dumb shock, before my mind could process what was happening, Bradley was upon one of the 2 villagers who had come with us, his hands around the man's throat. They tumbled to the ground together. Bradley raised his fist up and brought it bare down on the man's face. The man's head slammed to the ground and he seemed to fall unconscious. The second villager was on his feet now, charging towards Bradley. The roar of the helicopter grew louder and I heard Ivan shout over it, Carlos. My gun. Bradley gagged and I watched in horror as he pulled a glowing red worm from the back of his throat. He forced the unconscious man's mouth open and dropped the wriggling worm in. The second villager was on Bradley's back now, but it was no good. Bradley threw him off with ease, and then was upon him in an instant, grabbing at his neck as he had done with the first village. Carlos looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. Give him the fucking gun, I shouted as the helicopter hovered in the air above us. Carlos ran over to the bag in which he had hidden the pistol, as Bradley now pulled a second worm from his throat and dropped it in the other villager's mouth. Bradley stood up, whipped around, and turned his horrible red eyes towards me. Then he began running towards me with unbelievable speed. I tried to stand, but my legs would not cooperate, and I fell on my backside as reward for the attempt. I saw that Carlos had the gun in his hand and was running it over to Ivan, who was on his feet, watching us with preternatural calm. Then Bradley was on top of me, his hands at my throat. I couldn't breathe, and was struggling wildly. Wildly and with futility. Bradley had an incredible strength at his disposal, much greater, I thought, than his body had actually possessed. I watched helplessly, beginning to grow faint, as Bradley's mouth opened. A glowing red worm lit up the inside, wriggling out of it. He plucked it out with his hand, and then I heard the gunshot, and felt the splash of warmth, as he collapsed on top of me. With all of my strength, I shoved him off of me and scampered backwards. His eyes, no longer red, stared at me in frozen amazement. The bullet hole in his forehead trickled blood down into them. The helicopter was hovering above us. I saw the pilot through the window, with a rifle resting over his shoulder. Ivan fired 2 more shots, one in the head of each of the villagers. Then he trained his gun on me. Show me the worm, he shouted. I looked down next to Bradley's hand, and saw it squirming in the dirt. There, I shouted, pointing. Show it to me. I crawled over and tried to pluck the creature up with 2 fingers. It slipped away, but then was crawling on my hand. I shuddered, but managed to stand up and hold out my hand. "Here," I shouted. "See? It didn't go in me." I felt a slight itching sensation and saw that it was starting to go into me, burrowing into my hand. I tried pulling it away with my other hand, but it already had a tight grip. "Help!" I screamed. Carlos was at my side now with a desperate look on his face. He grabbed the worm with both hands and pulled. It stuck in me for a moment and I heard Carlos groan under the strain, and then he had it between his hands. He flung it to the ground and stomped on it repeatedly until it stuck to the bottom of his boots, a glob of jelly. He picked up a stick and scraped it away. "It didn't get her," Carlos shouted. "Tell that fucking helicopter to land." Ivan looked up to the helicopter, raised his hands, and dropped the gun to the dirt. He had a brief sign language conversation with the pilot, and then, at last, the helicopter began its descent. I barely heard Ivan over the now deafening roar of the helicopter. "Leave everything," he was shouting. "Just get on." The helicopter was almost within reaching distance when Bradley's body burst open at the stomach. 100 glowing worms crawled out of his body, along with something unspeakably horrible. It was a giant worm, 4 feet long, but it wasn't just a worm. It had a dozen insect legs, a monstrous beak like a bird of prey, and 6 glowing red eyes above the beak. I screamed in horror. The worm spread out and began crawling towards us. The helicopter stopped its descent and immediately began to rise into the air again. The horrid worm monster crouched on its legs and leapt 10 feet into the air to grasp onto the helicopter's skids. I alternated between watching the ground, stomping any worms that came close, and watching the scene unfolding above me. The pilot was attempting to control the helicopter with one hand, while the other fired the rifle aimlessly out of the window. The monster crawled up the side of the helicopter until it was right above the cockpit. The helicopter was now above the tree line, and moving away. Before it disappeared from view, I watched as the monster chewed a hole through the roof of the helicopter, and dropped through that hole. Then they were out of view, and I heard the crash moments later. Smoke billowed out over the top of the trees. "Kill them all," Carlos was shouting at the top of his voice, though the roar of the helicopter was now gone, and we were all already stomping the worms like mad. I picked up a rock and smashed it down on a worm, again and again and again. When we had scoured the area 4 times to make sure we had crushed them all, I sat down to catch my breath. "Ivan," I said. "Your samples." Ivan looked down to his belt, where he still had the canister clipped. He unclipped it, opened the lid, and dumped a dozen or so worms on the ground and stomped their wicked lives out. "We go back to village now," said Ivan. "We set up radio again and call for help." "No," said Carlos after a thoughtful pause. "Earlier, you said that other villagers had gotten sick like Bradley. There's more of them back there. God knows how many now." Ivan furrowed his brow. "Yes," he said. "We move on." "Move on?" I asked with an uneven voice. "How? Where?" "About 250 miles southwest. There is a village with road open all year." We hurriedly sorted through our supplies for anything that we thought might be useful for our seemingly hopeless journey, and packed 3 bags. Then we started walking. For 2 endless weeks, the 3 of us traversed the forest. We would have perished close to the onset, had it not been for Ivan's leadership, though Carlos and I contributed in our own ways. One white night around a week into our journey, we sat around a fire, cooking up fish from the river while Ivan began his story. "When I was boy," he said, pouring out the last of the carefully rationed vodka to each of us, "I lived in village much like where we were before. My family has lived there many generations. Very simple people. Very superstitious." He paused to take a small sip of the drink. "When I was 12, my mother got very sick. We save all we can, from fishing, and when roads open for winter, we travel to Yakutsk. I insist. A virgin, but already thought myself a man." As he spoke, he rolled a cigarette and I caught a glimpse of a smile on his face as I tended to the fish. It was the first time that Ivan had talked with us about himself. "Doctor says, lung cancer. No cure. We can send her to Moscow, but it costs a lot, far more than we have, and she will die still. We go back. The witch doctor, that is what he was. Gives her useless plants and mushrooms. She is dying. Then one night, I have dream. I am in a cave. Ahead is..." He took a drag of his cigarette and looked down at the ground for a moment. "Ahead is big glowing orange worm. He says, I can save your mother. Find me. I forget it until one day I am playing with friends. We are very bold, venturing out far. I see a cave. I am sure it is the same from my dream. I go in alone, my friends are too scared. It is small cave and I follow it for a long time, past many turns as it grows smaller. Then I come to a split. One way, there is faint orange glow. I get on stomach and crawl through narrow passage. I am now in big cavern and all around are the glowing orange worms, crawling on the walls. I took the fish off the fire with a stick, cut it up, and distributed it. We did not stand on ceremony, but ate out of our laps, with our bare hands. Ivan continued. I take a few worms and put them in coat. Then I go back. Mother is very, very sick. Asleep. I check my pocket. Most of the worms have died, and lost glow. But one is still alive. I take it to where mother is sleeping and put it on her chest. The worm crawls in her mouth. I almost pull it out, but let it go. Next morning, mother is better. Ivan took a bite of fish and looked at the still light sky. I looked for the cave again of course, but I could never find it again. No one else had seen it before or after. I sometimes wondered if it had all been a dream, and if it was true, as the witch doctor said, that his plants and potions had worked. But deep down, I knew it was the worm. You thought the worms in the crater. You thought those were your orange worms. You thought they could cure cancer, said Carlos, almost breathlessly. Yes, said Ivan. It is my fault. Then he did something remarkable. He began sobbing. Sobbing is not remarkable per se, but Ivan's sobbing was, because, though Carlos and I cried at least once a day, after everything that had happened, Ivan had not cried once. It's not your fault, said Carlos, putting his hand on Ivan's shoulder. I would have thought the same thing. Ivan lifted his head and stared in the fire. Like I said, my people are superstitious. We have many stories. We tell the story of the red worm. That is Diavel. The devil. Sometimes he takes the form of a red worm and enters your soul. Nobody had ever seen this, but everybody's grandfather had claimed his grandfather's grandfather had seen it happen. Ivan paused and kicked a rock in front of him. When we first arrived, and met Alyosha, he warned me. The red worm, he said. Diavel. I don't know why I thought an orange worm could cure cancer, but a Diavel worm was foolish. Ivan wiped his eyes and finished off his vodka. It is my fault Amy died. It is my fault Bradley died, and the villagers, and the pilot. And whatever happened in that village after we left. That is my fault too. Bullshit, I said. I was there with you. You told me that Alyosha claimed it was the devil. I stood there at the edge of the crater and let you climb down. But you did not see the orange worm cure cancer, said Ivan. You did not know about worms at all. No, I didn't see an orange worm cure cancer. But even if I had, I wouldn't believe folk stories about devil worms. I would have done exactly what I did. Anybody with even the slightest bit of scientific curiosity would have. It was so enticing. It's not your fault. Ivan smiled. We should get rest. We have a long way to go. One day, a week after Ivan told us his story, I had a terrible foreboding, and urged us on without breaks. Ivan had said that we were getting close. Carlos had a running estimate of the distance we'd traveled going in his notebook, and by his calculation, we only had about 20 miles left until we reached the village, a day or two's journey, depending on the terrain. Finally, we had to rest. Okay, I said. We'll get our strength back and then make one more push. One more push and we'll be back to civilization. Soft beds and hot showers. Meals beyond rodents and berries. Music. Wine. One more push. Ivan and I sat in silence on rocks as Carlos gathered sticks for a fire. The days were now noticeably shorter than when we had arrived in the village, and twilight was creeping in. Carlos came back with the sticks, arranged them just so, and lit them with Ivan's butane lighter. As he was standing up, an arrow whizzed through the air, pierced his shoulder and he howled in pain. I turned in the direction that the arrow had come from and saw a man standing there, notching another arrow in his bow. I recognized him. He was the villager who had inspected Amy's body in front of Alyosha's house. His eyes were glowing red. He had followed us all the way, a 2-week journey through the forest. I heard the crack of a pistol and watched as the red-eyed hunter's head snapped back and he fell to the ground. When he fell, I saw that off in the distance, a ways back from where he had shot his arrow, several pairs of glowing red eyes were glaring at us, moving towards us. I counted 6 pairs. Run, said Ivan, standing up. I grabbed the hand on Carlos' good arm, the arm that did not have an arrow sticking through its shoulder, and we ran like mad, jumping over roots, ducking under branches. Stop, I said to Carlos. I turned back and saw Ivan still standing by the fire, pistol in hand. Ivan! I called. Run you fools, he shouted. Run! I watched as an arrow shot past him, landed in the fire, and caught ablaze. Goodbye, Ivan, I yelled in a choked voice. We turned again and ran. I heard the first gunshot. I counted as we ran. 2, 3, 4. Carlos stumbled, but I dragged him forward and he regained his footing. 5, 6. 6 shots, 6 pairs of eyes. I felt the briefest moment of hope until a memory flashed through my mind, Bradley's body bursting open, and the horrible worm monster crawling out of it. Then I heard the 7th shot. We ran. Carlos grunted with every step, and my mouth was rough and raw, aching for water. I could scarcely feel my body. It was all just a dull ache. Running on felt inconceivable, but we ran on as darkness fell on us. In my head, Ivan's voice played on an endless loop. Run, you fools. Run. We ran, on and on, pulling each other through the missteps. At last, we broke out of the forest and onto a road. In the far distance, I saw the miracle of a vehicle approaching us. I grabbed Carlos' hand to run towards it, but he stayed rooted in place. I can feel them, my love, inside of me, he said, smiling sadly. They must have been on the arrow somehow. I can feel them squirming their way through me. Come on, Carlos, I said. Do you see? There's a car coming. We're saved. We've made it. I want you to know, I wouldn't trade 1 second of our time together for anything in the world, even knowing this is how it ends. We can't be but 2 hours from Yakutsk. We can get you help. Alicia. Please. This is goodbye. Let me hold you one last time. They're deep inside me now. I don't think they can get you. He opened his arms and I fell against his chest, trying now with my entire being to fight back tears, and failing. I love you so much, I said. You are all that matters to me, said Carlos. I love you. Go. Far away. Now. He reached down and kissed me deeply, and then he was gone, back into the forest. I stood in the middle of the road, weeping, waving my arms in the air. The car approached and came to a halt in front of me. A man rolled down the window and I stepped over to it. I pointed to the forest and said, Diavel. 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 Perhaps it was my desperation that got me that ride to Yakutsk, but more likely it was the stack of cash that I pulled out of my pack. And to think, it was more than once that I had handled that cash, there in the middle of an endless forest, and thought that it would be best to use it as kindling for a fire, to save our precious energy for another day. And I am telling you, the day may not be far away when that really will be the best use for cash, all across the world, from Siberia to Tampa, Florida. I have told some version of this story to countless officials, in several countries. This is what I have heard. The village where this all started is now completely desolate. So too is the village near where I finally emerged from the forest. That is not all. I have been following up with nearby villages, and one by one, they are becoming deserted. The worms are spreading. Most distressing of all, my contacts inform me that the crater where we initially found the worms has been thoroughly examined, and there was not a worm to be found. Where have those million worms gone? I know, in my gut, that they have been let loose upon the world, by the infected villagers. As yet, there have been no reports of any red glowing worms, or any people with red glowing eyes. I know, in my gut, that is because there have been no survivors. Their ranks are growing. And I'm finding that there are less and less people who believe me. My phone calls go increasingly unanswered. I arrived home last week, though it no longer feels like a home without Carlos here, after months of being away. I remember looking out the helicopter window, down at the vast Siberian forest, rising here in a mountain, cut there by a river, and thinking how incredible the planet was, and what a trivial thing a human being was in comparison. Holding a photograph of Carlos in my hands, I no longer feel that way. How I feel now is that I am going to find a way to crush every single one of those red worm devil motherfuckers under my boot heel. I have to. We have to. Or we'll be nothing but worm food.